I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are gonna glaze some yarn where I'm gonna dye a variegated colorway and then we're gonna over dye it with a layer of dye using a situation where the color is gonna strike to the yarn really quickly, so that way it feels like we have an airbrushed layer or a glaze of color on it. Before we jump in to talk about our yarn and the colors, I want to give a very special shout out today. My lab partner today asked that I give a shout out to the organization Mermaids UK. This is a nonprofit organization that supports trans, non-binary, and gender questioning youth, children, and their families. And I don't know how far they support outside of the UK, but it is a UK-based charity. I'm thrilled to learn about this organization. I'll have a link to them down in the video description. As you know, I always do a huge fundraiser every year for the Trevor Project, and so it's nice to know about similar types of organizations that exist outside of the US. Thank you so much to my lab partner for letting me know about this wonderful organization. And now let's go look at our yarn and our colors and jump on in. The yarn we're going to dye today is Wilta Dye Force Krypton 4-ply yarn. This fingering weight yarn is 100% fine superwash merino wool. The thing about calling this Krypton 4-ply that's weird is that there's actually only 3 plies in this yarn. So it is 3-ply, but when you call a yarn 4-ply or 3-ply, it means a few different things. One of them is the number of physical plies there are in the yarn. So this has 3 strands of yarn held together. For some people, the ply of the yarn is an indication of the thickness of that yarn. And this probably comes down to ages ago when when all the plies maybe were the same thickness. So an 8-ply yarn would be a lot thicker than say a 2-ply, but I could have this completely backwards. And so that's where my brain is going. But anyway, this is called Krypton 4-ply. I'm assuming because it's fingering weight, but really, again, it is 3-ply. Now I need to pre-soak our yarn. I've already added some zip ties onto it. And I'm adding it to this basin that just has plain tap water with no additional acid. We're gonna get acid into this yarn through our various dye baths. And in general, I prefer to have no acid in my pre-soak unless I know the technique I am going to do, because this gives me the most flexibility with my overall technique. Because if I decide I want to add, and I'm not planning on today, but if I decide I want to do a technique where I want to start with low acid to let those colors spread more, if I've already added acid in the pre-soak, now I need to rinse out the yarn a lot before I can use it. So this is what gives me the most flexibility. And I plan to let it pre-soak for 30 minutes. My plan today is to dye some yarn that is variegated blue and green, maybe blue, white, and green. I haven't decided if I'm gonna try to keep a gap in between the 2 colors or if I'm gonna dip dye completely. We'll sort of see how quickly the colors are striking to our yarn and make our decision as we go. And then I'm gonna take this variegated blue and green yarn that we've dyed and glaze it in royal purple. Now, Caribbean blue and emerald green are 2 colors that strike slow. And they're 2 colors that are prone to bleeding in hot water. So it's very likely, if we have any white left in our yarn before the glaze, that some blue and green is gonna leak out and then bind and backstain some of those other areas, which I'm totally fine with. And if you're concerned about the emerald green royal purple mix, those colors mix together completely beautifully. I have many videos where I've just mixed them together and dyed it. And so you get stunning colors there. So I know that this glaze on those 2 colors is gonna be lovely. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves to start preparing the dye. I weighed out 1/2 gram of the emerald green dye, dissolving it in a volume of hot tap water. That doesn't really matter because we're going to use all the dye for this project. I also measured out 1 gram of the royal purple dye to use for our glaze. This is a ratio to 400 grams of yarn that I know works well. I did not measure out some of the Caribbean blue because I already have a dye stock of that, so we will use our liquid dyes for that. The Caribbean blue dye is mixed at a concentration of 0.5 grams of dye per 100 milliliters. So since I want half a gram of that dye, I measured out 100 milliliters of our blue dye. In this dye pot, I started with 24 cups of water. I'm coming in with our half of a gram of Caribbean blue dye. And I'm gonna rinse out my graduated cylinder. And to this, let's add 6 tablespoons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tablespoons of white vinegar. We will need to add a lot of acid when we go to our glazing step, but when I glaze yarn, I like to start cold with high acid, so we'll need to reset our dye bath for that, but I'm planning on using this dye bath for our blue layer and our green layer. I don't know how much water has evaporated though, so it could be a little less than what we had before. Normally when I dip dye yarn, I will dye a maximum of 200 grams at a time. But we're coming in here with 400, and it is okay if the color is not perfectly even. We can choose to stop at whatever point we like, because you know what? I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh, well, I like that amount of color. So here's what I'm actually gonna do. As I pour that over, I'm grabbing a bonus skein of yarn because I like the color that we have, but I do want to leave the yarn with heat for a little bit. So I'm bringing in a bonus skein of yarn. You can see that there to just help absorb some of this excess color. The yarn I just added is Stroll fingering weight yarn. It is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. And I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a pan down to the side because you can sometimes get, what will happen if you leave yarn out is you can get some color wicking out, and that is not really what I am going for. Now, I'm doing this just based on the visual color. There's not that much color left. And you can see the color that I have in this stroll, I very quickly popped in, is not even. We have lighter patches and darker patches in there. It's okay if there's some blue left before we go ahead and do the green, but I want to just give this a little bit of some heat so we have some time for this color to set a little bit. There will probably be no white left, is my thought. But, you know, I think that most of the color was in the yarn when I first put it in. I just panicked a little bit because I didn't want it to get too dark. So I'm gonna go ahead and set a timer for 10 minutes, and then we will remove things and reset for our green. And ignore that beautiful color you see off in the background. Okay, it has been 10 minutes. I am going to take our yarn mop out first. Just set it aside. We'll use it for our green when I decide that I've had enough color. Okay, I'm going to set all of this blue dip dyed yarn aside. I'll come back to it in a moment. And in the meantime, we're going to add our emerald green dye. Rinse that out. And let's go move the zip ties on the yarn. Okay, so currently our yarn is like mostly blue with a little bit of white. I'm going to take the zip tie and move it to the best of my ability so that it's down at the deepest blue end. And the nice thing is that the white sections of our yarn are not hot. And so that means that this is a little bit easier than it could have been otherwise. And so now we can take this yarn and go and dye that green. The one thing I will do is give our dye bath a good stir. I feel like I've lost a lot of water volume over time, but now I'm going to come in and I'm trying to hold 2 skeins of yarn in each hand as I dip dye. Now the nice thing about emerald green and Caribbean blue is that as far as colors go, they absorb slowly, which is something that I've definitely mentioned. Okay, I am going to start to do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to grab our yarn mop, bring it in. Ooh, that's a really pretty color. Before we keep talking about this. Okay, what I was trying to say is that because these are both colors that we know spread a lot, that means that, okay, and I'm gonna leave just a little bit of the yarn in, most of the yarn out, but because the dye is one that spreads a lot, that means that I know I can get some amount of coverage on all 4 skeins. Whereas if I was dyeing 400 grams of yarn with a color that struck really quickly, like pink orchid, we would have a lot of white left where we've added these colors. But I have intentionally picked colors that spread, so that way we can get coverage. And the nice thing is, most of the green is in our Krypton. You can see that even laying there, the Krypton green is more saturated than that aqua that we're dealing with. But I'm gonna wait 10 minutes and then we can come back to remove, I guess, our yarn and to start to prepare for dip dyeing. And I'll add that 30 minutes of heat is not some magical color or magical amount of time. It's just a length of time that I found works for most colors to be well set and then not bleed later on. And so we have portions of our yarn today, specifically this middle, more teal area, where we've had very little heat. Certainly we have some heat because it's warm from the water that went in, but it's not sort of submerged in the dye bath. Now we will be adding heat when we do our glazing layer, so that isn't a problem for me. But if you wanted to take this colorway and sort of leave it as is, and I mean, it's gorgeous, one thing you could do is that you could go and steam set it if you wanted to avoid back staining or anything by submerging the yarn entirely in our dye bath. So you have options, but I'll see you in 10. Okay. Side note, this colorway is beautiful, which, I mean, it's not like it's a surprise that going from like green to blue would be beautiful. We did have some capillary effect. There's water down on the other pan. Let's set this aside. Let's check on our tonal. There's a hint of some color left in there. We are very, very steamy. What I'm gonna do is go ahead and heat this for 20 more minutes. There may still be dye left in the pan, there may not be, but then in 20 minutes, we'll remove this and start getting ready to do our glazing. Our 30 minutes are up, and so now I want to remove this yarn mop. Now, there's still a little bit of green left in the dye bath. That happens with this color. But I want to reuse this pot for our glaze. Our yarn today is absolutely gorgeous, stunning. And I'm gonna add a glaze to it, which I know that this is the point of a project where sometimes it's really hard to keep going towards my vision. I know we're gonna have something that is gonna feel darker overall. It's gonna feel more muted, and we'll still have bits of that blue and green and teal sort of showing through, but the feeling and the essence of the yarn is going to change. which isn't a bad thing. I just know that I'll hear some comments, I liked it so much more before the glaze. And you know what? That's okay, because I can create something very, very similar to this in the future. And so there are times in a video where I have a plan and then I hit an intermediate step and I stop. And then there's other times where I keep on going. But especially when I know I can recreate something myself, I'm much more likely to continue on for the vision than to just stop where I am. So let's go glaze this yarn. This is so pretty. There's not a huge amount of contrast in the colors, and actually it's really interesting how much, I guess, depth the blue has brought in, because this green feels a lot lighter and less pigmented than some of these other colors. But I am so excited to do the glaze. Now the yarn, the timeline wise, I'll be starting the actual glaze still in probably 10 or 15 minutes. So the yarn itself may be a little less steamy, but I do anticipate that it's still gonna be warm, which isn't gonna hurt anything. If anything, that can make the dye strike to the yarn pretty quickly in some ways. So we're going for it. Now, it does not really matter that we have color left in here or a little bit of dye around the side for our glazing step. However, I want to start our glaze cold. So I'm going to go ahead and go reset this pot and fill it up with 32 cups of cold water. To our dye bath, I'm going to add 450 milliliters of white vinegar. No, sorry, just 400. It was only 400 milliliters of white vinegar. I have gone back and forth over how much acid to use, and I think there was a period of time where I used like 400 to 500 milliliters, and then I was like, oh wait, I used too much, but the conditions worked, and so I reused it for a lot of things. So I'm reducing it just a little bit. For reference, 1 tablespoon of white vinegar is 15 milliliters. All right, I've added our 1 gram of royal purple dye. Gonna stir that up. Now for this project, this is a lot of vinegar. I probably should switch to citric acid just because I think it would be cheaper. And if I added like a couple tablespoons of citric acid, that would likely be plenty. And so that would be a good choice. But what I'm gonna do now, I haven't added the yarn yet. I've turned the heat on, but we're still very cold. Okay, our yarn is still warm. It is not hot. And what I'm gonna do is I have it sort of folded in half. I'm gonna add the yarn in, sort of move it around. We're gonna go up. Oh, this is so pretty. Down, wiggle, and leave. The more you move the yarn, we have to move it some because we want the dye to get coverage all over, but the more you move the yarn, the more you're going to allow that color to get inside the yarn, and that's not what we want. I do feel like I still need to do a video where I do, okay, let's do something that is over dyed versus glazed and try to show the difference, because the difference is ultimately pretty subtle. It can be very, very subtle, but if I wanted to just over dye this in a layer of the color, I would add it in cold, no acid, to really work that color all the way through, and that's just not what we're going for here. Now, from experience, and I can turn the heat up, I am going to heat this for an hour. The reason why I am doing an hour instead of just 30 minutes is that what I know from experience is that it's going to take about 30 minutes for this pot to heat up, to come to temperature, and then it's going to take another 30 minutes where I'm going to want the heat. So that is my plan. Now, I fully expect we're going to see a little bit of green probably in the water when we're done, but hopefully there'll still be some difference between the blue and the green. I'm curious about what's going to happen there and how much bleeding / backstaining we'll end up with. So unless something else significant happens, I'll see you in about an hour. If the goal for glazed yarn is to have the glazed layer of dye strike to the yarn quickly, and dye strikes to yarn faster when the dye bath is hot than it does when it's cold, Why am I setting up my dye bath cold? This is something that I've played around with over the years and is a technique and a result that ends up working well for me. I like to do the glaze cold because it allows me to get coverage of the dye all over the yarn. Whereas whenever I've tried doing glazes in a hot dye bath, the dye will strike really quickly to a portion of the yarn and then there won't be very much to go anywhere else. So the glaze layer is less even. So starting cold with a large volume of water allows the dye to come into contact with the yarn slowly. But the high acid allows that dye to strike to the yarn quickly, giving us that glaze. And so those are the different factors that I play around with as I do this. Now, the other component that is really important here is to pick a pigment, or I think royal purple is a blend of pigments. You want to pick a pigment that is going to strike to your yarn quickly. Emerald green and Caribbean blue are not good candidates for a glaze, but deep purple, dark navy, true black, potentially even deep magenta, which is more of a bright color, pink orchid, teddy bear brown, forest green, those are all colors that I have successfully glazed with in the past. The other thing that makes a good glazing color is that you want there to be contrast between what you have on the underlayer and the color you're glazing with. And so using a darker, more saturated color gives you a better shot of seeing the difference between the glaze and what you have underneath than, say, if you're using a color that is less bright, like, you know, a magenta, which is a bright pink, but not necessarily that dark. And so that contrast can be harder to see. But anyway, I'm waiting patiently. I'm not touching the yarn. Let's go see how she's looking. Wow. I don't know what I expected color-wise, but this looks so cool. Oh man, I gotta find the zip ties though, because things definitely moved around. Oh, I do see some glazing on here, and you can see that already. We do have uneven color coverage. You can see that down there, but you can see the glaze even now. Ooh, it's hot. I don't know why my tongs are working wonky today. I'm gonna set this aside to cool. You always want to be careful removing hot yarn from a dye bath. Here's this last zip tie. And for whatever reason, sometimes it's a little harder even when the pot is this full. But what I do sometimes is I'll take the zip ties and leave them out of the water for a moment before then lifting out the rest of the yarn. And oh my gosh, this is so, so pretty. And again, I don't know what I thought I was expecting, but I love it. I absolutely love it. And as we predicted, we got some greens left. Our water is green, but hopefully this means that our yarn won't bleed when we go ahead and wash it in a little bit. So I'm gonna let our yarn cool completely, and then we are ready to start washing things. I feel like what the camera's seeing is not doing justice to the beauty I see in person. But let's wash this yarn. It is still a little warm, which I definitely would not recommend if we were using non-superwash yarn. But for superwash, oh my god, that color is gorgeous. It should be okay. You know, I like to say that there are rules of thumb for when it comes to dyeing yarn. And there are some rules that I would never break, such as like PPE. I'm very careful to always wear a respirator mask when I'm dealing with dry dye powder. But occasionally, you want to finish your day of filming and dyeing yarn, so washing yarn that's a little warm is totally fine and not a problem. Don't worry, I would never do anything to compromise the integrity of the yarn that I'm dyeing. I'm only talking about this because there are times when you might be like, but wait, Rebecca, I thought you said to never do this. And while like things are all like mostly a rule of thumb, right? But This is beautiful. There is no color in our water, even after washing with dish soap. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish rinsing out the soap. Then I'm gonna put my yarn through the spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and I'll go ahead and wash our yarn mop off camera. So next time you see me, we'll be looking at our finished dry yarn. She's so pretty. Normally when I come to the conclusions, I would fluff the yarn up a little bit before laying it flat. But I really wanted to show how this is still on the zip ties before I take it off, give it a good snap, and then lay it out. Because don't get me wrong, there's such beauty in here, but it carries all the way through from the first moment that I looked at it that I had to just show it straight from the drying rack without the fluff. Now, this is a stage where you can look to make sure you have all the yarn going in the same direction before just giving it a little bit of a snap. Then I can lay it down, but it might shift the yarn a little bit. Here we are, all fluffed up. Our glaze gives the yarn so much more dimension than our colorway had before we added this additional glaze. And from far away, you can see just how uneven the glaze is. You can see areas where there's maybe almost no glaze, areas that feel much deeper, but overall, we have a lot of coverage of our purple on top of our blue and green. When you zoom in, you can really feel that airbrushed quality to it. You can feel like you're almost looking within the purple to see what is going on beneath the surface. Even on our blue, where there's less contrast, you still can feel that in here, which gives us something awesome. The last thing I want to add before I go and start twisting this up is that there's a color in here, and it's not quite our most blue, and it's not quite the most green, but some of this teal overlaid with the purple is such a magical combination. And I'd have to think about the proportions I'd need to mix that color to recreate a tonal that is just that, because it is delicious. The contrast here is amazing. And I think that that's the key to a really nice glazed colorway. Sometimes you can get a lot of contrast with white, but sometimes layering a reasonably saturated color with a glaze can add a little bit more dimension. Yes, it makes everything darker. It's going to do that. But, oh my God, I love it. I want to give another huge thank you to my lab partner today for supporting this video and also asking that I give a shout out to Mermaids UK. Please take some time and go check out the organization. I will have a link to it down in the video description. If you want to learn more about how you can become a lab partner for an episode of Dyepot Weekly, go and check out the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. You are more than welcome to remain anonymous. The shout outs that come with being a lab partner are meant for individuals, not businesses, because of like FTC guidelines and things. If I'm going to accept a sponsorship, I have to disclose that in a way which is very different from just giving a shout out to a viewer. But if you have any questions about all this, please send me a message on Etsy and I'm happy to explain the whole process and what limitations and things I have. And then of course, my Etsy shop is filled with hand-dyed yarn that's been featured in my videos. So that's always worth checking out, because bringing home yarn that I've dyed, not only do you get pretty hand-dyed yarn, not only are you helping make space for me to get more yarn and materials to create more videos, but you're supporting all the content here. And so it's a win-win-win. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and one other point I really need to make today is that this yarn is unbelievably soft. I have adored the Krypton line that Wool to Die For came out with. It is soft, bouncy, it glazes like an absolute dream, but also just absorbs color and is genuinely really fun to dye with. And I now don't have any more of it, but I could see myself absolutely ordering more of it in the future. I just feel like my camera is not doing this colorway justice. I am so unbelievably happy with it. totally didn't forget the yarn mop. I mean, who could forget this beautiful, bright green, bluish green mint tonal? There was a decent amount of pigment left behind in the pot for me to absorb. But part of that was also because I hit a point with our base color where I was like, you know what? I like where this color is and I want to roll with it. And that is completely valid. There are so many times where in a video I might say, wait until all the color is absorbed. But the asterisk is, if you like where your color is, you don't need to absorb all the color. You can stop, you can remove the yarn, you can heat set it in another way. But it is always fun to just use up all that last little bit of dye because we got this gorgeous tonal right here. Thank you so much for watching.